Thank you, Your Honor. With that, the defense rests.
Okay. Jurors, that is the evidence in this case after all these weeks. That's the evidence that you will hear in this case. The lawyers and I still have work to do for tomorrow. But tomorrow morning, we will have closing arguments of counsel. They'll get an hour apiece to be able to argue this case to you. I'll instruct you on the law, and then 12 of you will begin your deliberations sometime tomorrow.
The conclusion of the Karen Read murder trial could be just days, perhaps just hours away. Thanks for joining us for Canton Confidential. I'm J.C. Monahan. The defense rested today, and as you just heard from the judge, closing arguments begin tomorrow, followed by jury deliberations. First, we want to give you a quick recap of last week, which was week 8 of testimony. It began with the Massachusetts State Police crash reconstructionist. They took the stand. He was a prosecution witness who said scratches on John O'Keefe's arm came from the broken taillight. Then we heard from a project manager at Celebrite regarding Jennifer McCabe's Google searches. And another state trooper testified about text messages between John O'Keefe and Karen Read. Yes. And finally, the prosecution ended with a pathologist and the medical examiner. Now, on Friday, we heard the first witnesses called by the defense, including a Canton plow driver who went by 34 Fairview that night. He testified he did not see John O'Keefe's body in the front yard. He did see a Ford Edge parked outside the home in the early morning hours. Now, we also heard from a forensic pathologist who testified about injuries to John O'Keefe's arm, and a digital forensics expert who also testified on Jennifer McCabe's Google searches. And here we are today. We heard from the defense's final 3 witnesses, a forensic pathologist who testified about John O'Keefe's injuries, plus 2 accident reconstructionists. NBC 10's Kirsten Glavin is live at Norfolk Superior Courthouse in Dedham with details on the final day of testimony. Kirsten.
JC, this is another highly anticipated day in this trial. It's been nearly 2 months since we heard opening statements, and tomorrow we have the grand finale with closing arguments. After that, deliberations.
Jurors, that is the evidence in this case after all these weeks.
After 29 days, all evidence and testimony officially done in the Karen Read murder trial, with the defense resting their case Monday afternoon.
With that, the defense rests.
Outside of court, Read walking out satisfied.
Karen, how are you feeling now that this is all done?
I'm ready to be done with this. It's been a long haul. I'm on my 3rd year. I've worked on this case every day.
Jurors released for the day after hearing from 3 final witnesses.
You solemnly swear the evidence you give the court and the jury in the case now in the answer the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. I do.
First up, Dr. Frank Sheridan, a forensic pathologist and former medical examiner in San Bernardino, California.
That part at the elbow there is what I would think is the most likely candidate here for a bite mark.
Dr. Sheridan testifying that O'Keefe's arm injuries were consistent with bite and claw marks, adding that if he was hit by Read's vehicle, there would be more bruising.
You're equally unaware then that when that was tested, there was no canine DNA found from any of those swabbings in the area where the injuries that you're describing as scratch marks or bite marks occurred.
I wasn't aware of that. I must have missed it.
Next up, 2 accident reconstructionists hired by the Department of Justice and the FBI.
What is your opinion or conclusion as to whether or not the damage to the taillight was caused by striking John O'Keefe's head?
From a damage standpoint, it was inconsistent.
Both stating they did not believe O'Keefe's injuries matched the prosecution's theory.
Whether the ground could cause it or not, the roadway could cause it, the curb could cause it, a back could cause it. There's numerous different possibilities, and we don't really have enough evidence in this case to determine what one specific event actually caused that injury.
In a cross-examination, the experts doubling down.
Was there anything in there indicating that his arm was tucked in at the time that he was struck by the vehicle?
You know, there's no indication in any of that evidence of what he may or may not have been doing, how he may or may not have been positioned. I mean, that's the whole issue. There's no evidence to indicate what may have allegedly occurred in this case.
Now, it is worth mentioning there was a massive showing of support for Karen Read today outside of the courthouse, unlike what we've seen before. I actually spoke to one woman who said she came up from Alabama to see what happens this week. So the crowd out here really growing as anticipation for what happens also continues to grow here. JC.
Kirsten, as always, thank you. We're joined now by Michael Coyne, Dean at the Massachusetts School of Law. Michael, let's focus on what the defense did today. 3 witnesses on the stand. I want to start with the forensic pathologist, Dr. Frank Sheridan. What did you feel that they accomplished by having him on the stand?
Well, again, they supported the reasonable doubt and the defendant's argument about how the injuries occurred. The fact is they got a lot of that on cross-examination of the government witnesses, but now this was their chance to put in on direct testimony exactly how they believe the injuries were suffered. And it's consistent with everything else they've said previously, is that it wasn't as a result of a collision with the vehicle. It was likely scratches from a dog.
And then we have the 2 accident reconstructionists. They were up next. What were they able to deliver for the jury?
Again, basically the same point, that his injuries were not suffered as a result of an impact from a vehicle, but something else, everything else. And again, what's important about that is that it's the government's burden of proof in this case to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Karen Read, caused his death. And what we have is 2 expert witnesses in the day testify that you can't show that. There's too many missing pieces here. And that's just what the jury has before them as well. Far too many questions in all likelihood with the missing pieces.
That last piece in Kirsten's story really summed it up, which is we just don't have enough information. Of course, again, this is for the defense witnesses. What was the prosecution able to do with these 3, considering he had his own experts during his chance?
Yeah, not a lot, frankly. What they pointed out is that you didn't see all the evidence. You haven't heard some of the admissions and things like that. But the defendant didn't provide the 2 accident reconstruction experts any information. That was the federal government and the FBI that provided them that. And that's a real bonus for the defendant as well, because normally you pay an expert. And because you pay them, you should expect that they'll testify consistent with what you need. Here, they didn't pay them any money. It was the federal government that did. So they really are looked at in some ways as a neutral expert, not here for either side, here to speak the truth as you hope experts would do.
We're going to talk so much more about that because that part is fascinating, especially that the jury doesn't know about this other investigation, the FBI investigation. Michael's not going to go anywhere. He's staying with us. After the break, we are joined by Catherine Loftus and our courtroom insider, of course, Sue O'Connell. We're going to compare these expert witnesses for both the prosecution and defense and talk about what's next in the trial. And just a reminder, you can watch all of our Canton Confidential episodes on our website or YouTube, or listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Canton Confidential.
You were not hired by the defense in this case, correct?
That is correct.
At the time you did your expert review, Dr. Wolf, and your consultation, you and I had never met.
That's correct.
You did not know who I was?
I did not.
You had never met Ms. Little?
No.
Mr. Yannetti?
No.
Matter of fact, you'd never heard of this case.
That's correct.
You were hired by another agency not connected in any way to the defense, is that right?
Correct.
And not connected in any way to the Commonwealth, is that right?
Correct.
That is defense attorney Alan Jackson questioning one of his expert witnesses. Once again, the jury is hearing about this other big part of the case without really hearing anything about it, which is the FBI investigation. Michael Coyne is back along with local attorney Catherine Loftus, also known on TikTok for Note My Objection, and of course our courtroom insider Sue O'Connell. I'm going to start right there with you, Sue. We know about the FBI investigation. That was Alan Jackson just dangling, oh, by the way, I didn't hire you. You did all this work, but it had nothing to do with me. What is the jury doing?
So there was a sidebar not long after that, and 3 jurors, one of whom we keep referring to as Pam from The Office, because that's what she looks like, right in the front row. They looked at each other like, what? You know, T, you know.
Right.
What's going on here? Not
3
that
letters
they were
of the alphabet.
confused about what the testimony was, but they were just kind of confused as to what this backstory was. They all reacted. Mm-hmm. And then when the next witness came up, and it was the same setup, because remember, they don't know what witnesses are coming up, mm-hmm. They again looked at each other like, what we have these free professional witnesses coming in from some other agency. I mean, that's me reading their minds, which I swore I wouldn't do. But at the same time, that's what it looked like.
Well, and Catherine, let me throw it to you then. Michael touched upon this a little bit, but prosecution and defense, do they normally, when they hire them, they are paying for these witnesses?
Yes, they are paying, as long as they're outside. So any of the witnesses for the Commonwealth who have been from the state police, the crime lab, they're all employed by the state. Anybody outside of that is paid privately on both the defense side and the, and that hasn't really come up that much with any of the expert witnesses. So I'm not sure that that is within the common knowledge of the jury. But it's certainly when you hear, oh, wait, well, then who hired? That's going to be the question the jury's asking. Well, if it wasn't you and it wasn't you, who hired you?
Well, under this sort of shroud of secrecy, does that elevate their credibility or do they step back, in your experience?
As a general matter, it would elevate their credibility because they are not subject to the regular impeachment of, so you've received $100,000 or more in order to prepare to testify and testify today. So the fact is that not having been paid by the defendant, they should be looked at as a little more honest about their actual assessment in the case. And that's what I would expect.
Although it is interesting if you if you went the next step, and that's the hard thing about not being able to talk about the federal investigation because they were paid by somebody. Right?
You're right.
And so what information, and we saw that they didn't have all of the discovery, they didn't have the UC Davis thing. So it's interesting to be, it's almost this third party and what's the bias there, if any, but you really can't go into that line of inquiry. So it just leaves more questions, I think, for the jury.
But they did say some things on the cross that they offered, I think, that were somewhat helpful to the prosecution, not in the, the mountain of evidence and testimony they were giving, which did give me pause a couple of minutes, like, well, they really are just calling it like they could see it. They're not trying to customize their answer to make it not so damaging to the defense. They just said what they saw and they put it out there, and I think the jury also reacted to that.
And if the jury has questions about the FBI investigation and the government investigation, so do we all. None of us know anything about it, and we all are curious as to what the result is of that investigation.
When do we hear about that investigation?
We don't
know.
Or never. We might have never.
This is a question from Michael D., and I think we all are a little curious about this. Basically, what would you guys estimate the cost is for this trial? Michael, you had just mentioned on the prosecution side, that's a public record that you can find.
Right.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty. What's the defense? How much is someone paying for all of this?
If it's a flat fee, and a lot of times criminal cases are taken on a flat fee, I would guess that both Yannetti and Jackson have charged at least $250,000 up front.
Okay.
If it's based on an hourly, and it's not likely, but look at the hours they have spent on this case, and their hourly rate likely would be, and it's not just theirs, it's the others in the courtroom, you are easily north of 7 figures.
And what about in adding in the expert witnesses?
Well, you have the expert witnesses, like you said.
That's not part of the $250.
No.
This is just what you pay them.
Right.
So, for example, in this question that was from Michael D., they talked about what about the fact that they had to be put up here in Boston, or that any effort that was put into, let's say, Karen Reed's appearance or whatever you would spend on that.
And they might have to fly in last minute because they didn't know when they were going to testify.
Those are all chargeable costs. Their dinners in the North End that we've seen pictures of, those are chargeable expenses to the client.
I wouldn't be surprised if it's upwards, even if it's in the $250, $500, total just for trial, even outside of the pretrial. And it's interesting, there's been GoFundMes, there's been a lot of money raised. I wouldn't be surprised maybe if there's some back end, book deals, things like
definitely.
that.
I don't think Alan Jackson is
on the front end,
taking this for, pro bono. Don't worry about it. I gotcha.
I'm guessing not.
No. When we come back, we're talking about closing arguments and when we may get a verdict. Stay right there. And of course, don't forget to send us any of your questions you may have for one of our experts. Send us an email at canton.confidential@nbcuni.com. Welcome back. Our legal experts, Michael Coyne and Catherine Loftus, are back with us as we look ahead to what's next. We heard the opening statements. Now tomorrow we get closing arguments. Let's start with the prosecution. How similar will those be, and what will you be listening for?
They're going to be they need to hone in on the evidence that they have, because we've heard lots and lots and lots of rebuttal evidence against a third-party theory. They really need, if they're going to spend any time on that, it needs to be small. They need to present it as this, the defense wants you to believe this fantastical story. It's made up of this, piece and this piece. But what we really want you to focus on is the evidence that we have here. And I think that's the only way to go, is really just focus on what they think is the strength of their case.
Yeah,
what is the evidence?
Consistent with the judge's instruction to use their common sense. They will be told that. They will likely and should hammer on the drinking, and because the level of intoxication, both on the victim as well as the defendant, were very high. The driving under extraordinary conditions in a blizzard, and ultimately his death. They need to hammer at that over and over again, and then ask them to really take a look at the evidence with respect to no one testified he ever went into that house. That's the strength of their case. That's what we should have been hearing for weeks now, and they need to hammer that.
It's their last chance.
It's a last chance, and it's a Hail Mary in all likelihood. But that's what they better do. And from the defendant, they're going to they're going to use the argument about reasonable doubt that we don't know, to use the words of the last expert. There's just too many open questions that we have to be able to say, to a moral certainty that she's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
The Judge Cannoni said they'd have each about an hour. Well, A, is that typical? And B, do you think both sides would need an hour to make their case?
It's pretty typical. They don't want them to drone on too long. I think she gave them 45 minutes, an hour or so for the opening statements. You want a little bit more time. It usually takes a little bit longer in closing, because as things develop through trial, there might be things that came out that you didn't have at the front end. But it seems fairly typical. She also wants to move things along. She wants to get to the jury instructions by tomorrow. She wants to get them the case by tomorrow afternoon so they can just start deliberating.
Just a quick question. I know we'll get the jury instructions, and I'm sure we'll all have a little bit of a better understanding. But even if the judge says you must do A, B, C, D, E, must they, or could they get into the deliberation room, look at each other, go, are we all on the same page? Great, yes, yes, and that's it?
It could be a relatively quick verdict if they will look at the charges, but there's only ultimately 3 that they're going to focus on, that they've been focusing on from day one. There are some lesser included offenses that they'll have an opportunity to look at. But at the end of the day, the question really comes down to, did she, with that Lexus, cause his death? And it's a pretty straightforward question for them at this point. And I don't think they will likely spend long looking at those charges.
All right. We're going to have both of you back. We're not done just yet. Starting as early as tomorrow, we will be on Verdict Watch here on NBC 10 Boston. If you have our app, you'll get an alert as soon as there is a verdict. We'll be on air covering it, of course, as it happens. When we come back, emotions from the Karen Read case spilling into the streets of Canton. We'll talk about Turtle Boy and the 2 people now facing charges for allegedly assaulting him. Well, there is one other story outside the trial itself to get to tonight. 2 people have been charged with assault after a heated confrontation involving the blogger known as Turtle Boy.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Cell phone video obtained by NBC 10 Boston shows Aiden Carney, or Turtle Boy, arguing with people outside a bar in Canton Sunday evening. The video was shot by Carney's girlfriend. You can see at one point there's one man who was later identified by police as James Ferris swiping at someone off camera. It also shows a woman, later identified as Jillian Daniels, taking Carney's cell phone. Now, police confirmed the 2 have been charged with assault and battery. NBC 10 Boston has not been able to independently determine what led up to the confrontation. We reached out to Ferris, who said he has no comment. We made multiple attempts to contact Daniels for comment and have not heard back, and a court date has not been set. Back with us, our Sue O'Connell. Sue, what is this?
Well, this is following a few years of what many witnesses in the Karen Read trial will say was harassment that they felt that they had gone through, targeting them for things that they did or didn't say in court, that Turtle Boy was also leading the charge against. There are witness intimidation charges against him. So here he is in Canton over the weekend, and whatever happened before this was the result. But it's emblematic of the turmoil that many people in Canton have been feeling. I hear from many people. As I said, I lived there for 10 years, about 10 years ago. many people really concerned about how they're going to heal after this.
That was my question, because how do you do that in a town of, 25,000 people? You're walking down the center of town with your family, and this breaks out because of this trial. How long will it be before things are normal or a new normal?
Yeah, I don't think they will be. And again, this also is after years of people being targeted and being called names and being followed to their kids' soccer games and whatnot. So we'll see. We'll have to wait to see the trials over and see if Canton's able to find a way to heal.
There's so much more we'll be looking at. Sue, thank you so much. That is all for us for Canton Confidential tonight. Of course, we're back at 7 o'clock tomorrow, possibly on Verdict Watch. Closing arguments start tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. And remember, we are live streaming the entire trial on our website, on YouTube, and on air on NECN. Hope to see you all back right here at 7 o'clock.